They approached in perfect alignment, but we sent them back in flames. From my seat, high above the sea, I watched the most formidable Japanese air fleet ever assembled fall apart in pieces as it met the blue skies over the Pacific. Squadrons of enemy fighters and bombers came at us in waves, their wings flashing like mirrors in the early sunlight. Yet by the evening of June 19, 1944, more than 600 of their planes would lie scattered at the bottom of the Philippine Sea, and American carrier aviation would record an unmatched triumph in air warfare history. I'm Lieutenant Commander Jack Tech Morrison, a fighter pilot flying off the USS Essex. I flew an F-6F Hellcat during what would be remembered as the Great Air Clash over the Marianas. What I saw that day shifted the momentum of the war in the Pacific and marked the end of Japanese dominance in carrier aviation. The morning started like many others aboard the Essex, with the shrill alarm signaling battle stations at 5:30 a.m., and the well-practiced frenzy of a warship bracing for action. I had been at the controls of a Hellcat for a year and a half, flying through major operations at Tarawa, Quilon, and Truk. But standing on deck that morning, watching the light of dawn spread over our fleet, I sensed this would be unlike anything before. Admiral Raymond Spruance had pulled together an unprecedented concentration of sea power. 15 swift carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers arrayed in 4 separate groups over 25 miles of ocean. Our combined air groups could launch over 900 planes, more than many nations' entire air forces. The order for pilots to get to their aircraft echoed across the deck. Red-shirted deck crews made their final checks on our Hellcats. I climbed into my plane, number 47, settling into the seat with the familiar weight of my gear and the cold metal of my sidearm pressing at my waist. Not far off, my wingman Bobby Chunjust, 19, already credited with 4 enemy kills, gave a nod from his cockpit. He was young, but he carried himself with a steady calm as he ran through his preparations. Then came the voice of our air group commander, David McCampbell, crackling over the radio. He told us the enemy fleet was 300 miles west, launching a force of over 400 aircraft. What he didn't say, and what we'd only learn later, was that Admiral Ozawa had committed everything he had. The Japanese had launched nearly 400 carrier-based aircraft from 9 at tops, supported by 50 more planes from Guam and Rota. It was the most massive aerial strike Japan had ever launched from carriers. Ozawa was gambling the entire naval war on its success, but we had key advantages they didn't know about. Our new Hellcats outclassed their Zeros in every way except tight-turning ability. They were tougher, faster, better armed. Most critical of all, we had ground-controlled radar guidance, letting us intercept incoming squadrons with precision. At 6:15 a.m., I got the launch signal. The catapult hurled my 12,000-pound Hellcat forward and into the sticky tropical air. Soon, I was leading for fighters in a steep climb westward, where our radar was already tracking the enemy. A voice came over the radio, bearing 280, altitude 18, large formation. All squadrons, intercept and engage. The voices of fellow pilots filled the airwaves, calm, businesslike. No panic, just the focused rhythm of men trained for this very moment. My wingman Bobby came on the radio, reporting visual contact with the enemy, about 50 planes approaching. I looked ahead and saw them 2 Japanese dive bombers high above, escorted by Zeros, with more following behind like a grim procession. We were told to follow Attack Plan Baker. That was our cue. Asterisk, we descended from the sun's glare, catching them off guard. The first wave never stood a chance. Months of practice and real battle had shaped us into a deadly force. Our 16 fighters engaged 50 enemy planes with a discipline born of experience. I picked a Zero trying to evade another pilot's fire. The Japanese flyer handled his machine well, making sharp moves, but agility couldn't match our speed and weapons. I waited, then fired. My machine guns lit up, sending incendiary rounds into his engine. The plane jerked, spat black smoke, and dropped toward the sea. I reported the kill and quickly veered away from the falling debris. But there was no time to pause. The air was alive with radio calls, pilots warning, tracking, engaging. Tracers streaked everywhere. Planes burned, parachutes floated down. We were winning, but not without loss. Some of our boys weren't going to make it home. Then I heard Bobby again. He spotted 3 dive bombers heading for our fleet and asked permission to engage. I gave the go-ahead. I watched him dive, his guns flashing. The enemy gunner returned fire, but Bobby's approach left him little chance. His first shots missed. The second struck home, flames racing down the enemy bomber. It spiraled downward. In a black plume, another Japanese plane tried to run, but Bobby caught up, tore it apart with his guns, and it plunged into the ocean. 2 more down. But more enemy planes were on the way. The Japanese were sending them in batches, which let us pick them off group by group, but it also meant the fight wouldn't end quickly. Radar reported another wave, over 60 more planes incoming. I checked my fuel and ammo. I was down to half my bullets and my fuel was dropping fast. But I knew every enemy bomber that made it through could mean the death of our shipmates. I told Bobby to form up again. We climbed to meet the next group. Below, the sea was dotted with the wreckage of destroyed planes ours, and their rescue boats sped toward fallen airmen. Off in the distance, our carriers and battleships braced for the next attack, their guns ready. The Japanese were fearless. I'll give them that. Even with devastating losses, they kept pressing forward. But courage alone couldn't make up for the mismatch. Their machines, their pilots, their strategy, they were all outclassed. Our leader, McCampbell, came on the radio again, steady and confident. He reminded us to rely on our training, stick with our partners, and not get drawn into turning fights with the nimble Zeros. He urged us to show the world what American naval aviators could do, and what followed would become one of the most overwhelming air victories ever recorded. By mid-morning, the air battle had turned into a grim spectacle of destruction. The second wave of enemy aircraft, totaling 68, was decimated just like the first. American fighters were being directed with pinpoint accuracy to intercept Japanese formations, and radar teams had eyes on every incoming plane from over 100 miles out. I was leading my squad toward a group of enemy torpedo bombers when Chen's excited voice broke through my headset. He shouted for me to check my left. There was an entire squadron of torpedo bombers closing in on our carrier, flying in perfect V-shaped alignment. The Japanese Nakajima B-5, inescapably called, Kates, held their course with unwavering precision. These weren't rookies, they were seasoned aviators, likely among the best Japan still had. But flying in formation made them easy prey for our Hellcats. I alerted all nearby units to intercept them immediately. What unfolded next could have come straight from a training manual. 8 of our fighters attacked from multiple sides, tearing through the enemy bombers with sheer speed and overwhelming firepower. Despite the heavy defense from the Japanese gunners, whose bullets filled the air with streaks of light, their outdated guns were no match for our weaponry. I locked onto the lead bomber and opened fire from a quarter-mile out, my 6.50 caliber guns ripping into its left side engine. The bomber began leaking fluids, but stubbornly kept heading toward the fleet. I closed the distance and fired again, blasting through the cockpit and eliminating the gunner. Still, the pilot stayed locked on course. It was a level of resolve I had to respect, even as I aimed to stop him. My third burst struck the fuel tank, igniting the aircraft in a fireball. I had to veer sharply to avoid the wreckage as it disintegrated. Mid-air, I confirmed a kill over the radio while scanning for another target. All around me, other pilots were reporting kills. One was bringing down dive bombers. Another had a fighter spiraling into the sea. Then came Chun's unforgettable call. After shooting down his third enemy of the day, his youthful voice crackled over the radio, comparing the battle to a shooting gallery at a carnival. That offhand comment spread quickly from cockpit radios to naval dispatchers, then to journalists. In Hawaii, by the end of the day, headlines across the United States would christen the fight as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name stuck. By midday, a third enemy wave approached. This time, the Japanese executed a more cohesive attack, sending 109 planes in a single, well-structured formation. On paper, this should have overwhelmed us, but it didn't. Commander McCampbell himself led the response, guiding 40 Hellcats with measured authority. He reminded us to stay close, pick targets carefully, and remember that any missed aircraft could bring disaster to our ships. What wasn't said, but would become obvious later, was that this third group included many of Japan's most seasoned pilot survivors of earlier engagements. But no amount of experience could make up for what we had: better planes, sharper training, advanced coordination, and, crucially, far greater numbers. In the 20 minutes that followed, over 150 aircraft tangled in a deadly aerial brawl within a space smaller than a city. The Japanese still had flashes of their former excellence. I saw 1-0 dodge Parker's attack with a flawless roll and pull into a climb that would have been impossible for a heavier aircraft like mine. But skill alone wasn't enough. We had newer planes, faster response systems, and clear radio communication that made a difference. We also had the industrial power of the United States behind us, training pilots and rolling out aircraft in quantities Japan could never hope to match. I was chasing a particularly persistent Zero when Chen's voice cut in, stressed but steady, had a Japanese dive bomber on his tail. I scanned the sky and spotted him a couple of miles away, twisting and turning to shake off a Yokosuka D4. Why, Judy? The Japanese pilot flew with the agility and aggression of a fighter, staying locked onto Chun's tail with expert precision. I told him to dive left and headed in. Rolling my Hellcat into a steep dive, I built up speed fast. The enemy pilot was so focused on Chen that he didn't spot me until it was too late. My rounds chewed through the tail of his bomber, forcing him into a sharp descent, but he didn't quip. He skimmed just above the ocean in a desperate low-level chase that turned into one of the closest air battles I'd ever fought. For 5 long minutes, we danced barely above the waves, pushing our aircraft to their limits. The Japanese pilot showed his experience, maneuvering with cleverness and determination, but his plane was damaged, his ammunition nearly gone, and, eventually, the strain became too much. He attempted a final desperate maneuver, pulling into a tight upward arc, trying for one last shot, but the stress was too much. His left wing gave way, and the bomber tumbled into the sea in a burst of water and metal. Jin's voice came through again, this time calm but shaken. He thanked me quietly. That one had nearly ended him. By mid, the Japanese had launched 4 full-scale assaults, committing more than 370 carrier-based planes to the offensive. The result was devastating for their fleet. Even as we fought, the scope of their losses was becoming clear. One after another, enemy aircraft fell burning into the ocean. The radio buzzed with reports 1-0 down. A torpedo bomber splashed, 2 dive bombers gone. One squadron alone had 6 confirmed kills. Then we got the full picture. The fighter control team aboard the Essex transmitted the tally: 220 enemy aircraft destroyed. The number stunned even our most experienced flyers. In one day, we had taken out more planes than entire campaigns had claimed. And still, the enemy wasn't done. Admiral Ozawa, in a last-ditch effort, began launching every remaining plane in his arsenal. Some were patched-up wrecks, others flown by green pilots barely trained. Even training planes were thrown into the fight. It was the final gasp of Japan's carrier air force. We got the alert. A large formation approaching from the west, believed to be their last. We were told to end it. The final attack consisted of 102 planes, a mix of fighters, bombers, and torpedo aircraft, representing all that remained on 9 carriers. Many of the pilots were raw, some barely able to keep formation, but they charged in with the same grim bravery we'd seen all day. I was part of a group of 36 Hellcats sent to intercept them before they reached our fleet. What happened next? Barely qualified as combat. The Japanese formation crumbled under pressure. They couldn't hold together, and we cut through them with ruthless precision. Chen added 3 more kills in just 10 minutes, calmly picking apart a group of Zeros. The enemy tried to evade, but their moves were predictable, their machines slower. After downing his 7th aircraft of the day, he called it in with quiet pride. Still, not everyone folded easily. One particularly skilled enemy pilot gave me a long, grueling fight. His Zero danced through the air with incredible agility, countering my every move. For 15 minutes, we chased each other through the sky, neither gaining the upper hand. His tight spirals canceled my speed advantage and gave him fleeting chances to shoot. But eventually, he made one fatal miscalculation. He stayed in one spot too long, giving our pilots time to close in and join the fight. Just as he moved head-on toward me, Lieutenant Parker came down from above. His Hellcat's guns opened up, tearing into the enemy fighter from behind and above, ripping the Zero apart mid-flight. I thanked him over the radio, half laughing as I told him that one was starting to cost me too much. By 4:30 in the afternoon, the last wave of enemy planes had been wiped out. Our radio chatter confirmed it. Every hostile aircraft had been shot down or forced to flee. Not a single torpedo had reached our ships. No damage had been inflicted on the task force. As we regrouped and made our way back to the carriers, the weight of the day's events began to hit us. In just a matter of hours, our carrier-based fighters had eliminated more than 400 enemy aircraft, while our losses numbered only 29. It was the most decisive aerial victory ever recorded. But this battle wasn't just about numbers. Strategically, it had shattered the offensive power of Japan's mobile fleet. Though 9 of their carriers remained afloat, they were useless. There were no longer any aircraft left to launch. From that point forward, Japan would never again mount a credible carrier-based attack. Commander McCampbell's final message to all squadrons captured the moment. We'd crushed the backbone of Japan's naval aviation. The enemy would not forget what had happened. As I brought my Hellcat down onto Essex's deck that evening, I was worn out but proud. I had personally brought down 4 enemy planes that day, pushing my total to 11. But more important than any individual accomplishment was being part of something that changed the course of the war. The mechanics and deckhands greeted us with cheers, clapping us on the shoulders, their faces lit with pride. Still, under the celebration lay a quiet recognition of the cost. Both sides had lost men. That Damon, who had fought with everything they had. That night, under a sky lit with stars and the calm hum of engines, I stood on deck, trying to absorb what we'd done. In half a day, our task force had ended Japan's ability to use aircraft carriers as an offensive weapon. More than 600 enemy planes had been destroyed, 400 in the skies. The rest destroyed on airstrips across islands like Guam. The toll on their fleet was crushing. 3 carriers had been sunk by our submarines, and of the 6 that survived, barely 40 aircraft remained. In total, worse still, was the loss of trained airmen. Years of training, knowledge, and experience had been lost beneath the waves. Later that night, around 10 p.m., I saw Chen on the deck, still wearing his flight suit, damp with sweat. He'd taken down 7 enemy planes that day, also bringing his total to 11. but there was no bravado in his expression, just weariness and quiet pride. He lit a cigarette with hands that still shook a little from the tension. He said it had been quite a day. I told him he'd done exceptional works. 7 kills in one mission was something few would ever match. He exhaled slowly and looked out at the sea. Then he asked if I thought we'd really finish them. I thought of the Japanese pilots who had flown broken planes into battle with barely any training, knowing their chances were slim. That kind of resolve is both admirable and chilling. I told him that their carriers might still be floating, but they had nothing to launch and hardly any pilots left who could land on a flight deck. Yes, I said, I think we broke them. The real question was whether they'd accept it. Soon after, word came down that parts of our fleet were being sent to chase the retreating Japanese. There were whispers about launching nighttime raids to finish what had been started, but it seemed the enemy was already in full flight, moving west as fast as possible. Just before midnight, McCampbell spoke to us again. He confirmed the numbers: 402 enemy planes shot down, with only 29 American losses. That ratio over 13-to-1 was unprecedented. He reminded us that we had ended Japan's carrier air threat for good. The cheers that followed echoed through the ship, but then he added that this victory had come at a price. Good men had died, and it was their sacrifice that made our success possible. That sobering truth quieted the mood. We had lost 29 aircraft. 16 pilots and crewmen were either dead or missing. While low, given the size of the battle, every one of them represented a family left waiting for news that might never come. I thought about Lieutenant Williams, who was hit during the second wave. I had seen his plane trailing fire as it dropped toward the sea. No parachute was seen. Somewhere back in his hometown, his loved ones were probably clinging to hope. The following morning, it was confirmed. The Japanese fleet was in full retreat, having lost much of its carrier power. Admiral Spruance chose not to pursue them, believing that we had already achieved the crucial objective. Some questioned that call, and many still debate it. But standing on the flight deck as our planes were readied for routine patrols, I understood. We had dealt a decisive blow. Why risk more lives chasing a force that had already been defeated? In the weeks that followed, as we turned our attention to striking enemy island bases, the true impact of our win became clearer. Intercepted messages showed how deep Japan's losses ran, not just the hundreds of dead airmen, but the collapse of their training system. Their reserves of experienced aviators had been running thin since 1942. The campaign on Guadalcanal had drained much of their skilled force. Battles at places like Rabaul and Truk had nearly finished them. The fight over the Marianas simply sealed it, wiping out not just machines, but the hard-earned knowledge it took to fly them. Chen and I continued flying missions for another half-year, taking part in invasions of Guam, Saipan, and the Philippines. But we never saw large formations of Japanese aircraft again. There were still some attacks, lone suicide, pilots, or small groups attempting to break through, but never again did the enemy mount a full-scale carrier-based offensive. The great battle over the Marianas had ended that chapter for good. In 12 hours of fighting, our naval air power had erased a threat that had cast a long shadow since Pearl Harbor. The once feared Zero fighters, symbols of Japanese dominance, were now being flown by boys too young, too rushed through training, and ultimately, no match for us. Now, decades later, I can still picture those enemy squadrons coming through the misty sky, gleaming wings reflecting the sun, flying with discipline and hope toward a fate they couldn't escape. They came with courage and conviction. We sent them back in flames, their wreckage strewn across the sea. The fight was over. What had started as a battle turned into a rout. From that day forward, American aircraft ruled the Pacific skies. The enemy never truly had a chance. But still, they came. Right to the very end. And for that, I can't help but respect their bravery, even as I fought to stop them. In the quiet that followed the fury, their absence in the skies was unmistakable. That silence was the sound of victory earned through grit, sacrifice, and the full strength of a determined nation. We had destroyed their naval air power once and for all. The rest of the war would be about finishing what had already been decided.